Welcome to my lecture on Life is Simple, Science is Occam's Razor. The claim that the basic tool of science, the fundamental thing that science does, is try to deliver a simpler world. And what I'm going to be talking about is the origin of this idea, which goes back to the medieval world, perhaps even earlier, and the work of William of Ockham, who was a Franciscan friar, and his attack on complexity of the attempts to account for the world in medieval times. And I will be looking at how his razor, the principle that entities should not be multiplied beyond necessity, was then used by subsequent scientists such as Copernicus, Kepler, Newton, Einstein, etc., to make better sense of the world, and that we still need this razor today to keep making sense of the world. So first, as I said, a little bit about William of Ockham. He was a Franciscan friar born in the village of Ockham, which you can see the map here. It's just southwest of London, close to the University of Surrey, which is where I work. So I have a local interest. Over here, top left, is the only portrait we have of him, and this is the village of Ockham, where he was born, but he didn't spend long there. He has an uncertain history. Probably was a foundling, as they would call them in those days. A child that was left in the grounds of a monastery, a Franciscan friary, in fact, and then brought up by the monks. And so we don't know anything about his parentage. But we do know that he then left Ockham to go to university at Oxford. And this was not long after the university was established in Oxford, the first British first English university. And he studied there he came there about 1320, and he studied theology. Obviously, he was a Franciscan friar, so that was the obvious subject for him to study. But he didn't complete his degree. This is when it becomes interesting. Now, it's interesting also that theology at the time was called the Queen of Sciences, which is rather kind of strange title for the subject that we now know is entirely theoretical about God and the angels and stuff like that. But at the time, they discussed things like what the heavens were made of, what the gates of heavens were made of, where was the water, if there was water outside the firmament, and those kind of questions, which they considered to be science in the sense that they were testable in some way, and that someone would eventually be able to find out these questions. But he didn't complete his degree. And now what I've done here is put the medieval view of the world, which is kind of hard to get your head around when we're so embedded in our own cosmic view. They had a simpler world. This world was the earth beneath their feet. And although it's often called the geocentric perspective of the universe, it was really what you might call diablocentric, because the devil was at the center, hell was beneath your feet, heaven was up in the sky behind the planets and the stars, and the sky was the firmament of heaven, such that you could imagine if you could climb high enough, you could pull back this curtain of stars and planets and look into heaven itself, see God. And so people in the medieval world were kind of very embedded in this view that they were part of a mystical, holy place that was where they lived. This view kind of has lots of its roots in the ancient Greek world, and particularly Aristotle. Now, we'll come to the sense of this in a moment, because it does have implications for how Occam's razor started to make sense make a different kind of sense of the world. So this view, the geocentric view of the cosmos, the scientific geocentric view of the cosmos, was really championed by Aristotle. It has earlier roots in Greek philosophy, maybe elsewhere as well, but it was championed most by Aristotle, who believed that the Earth was at the center, as it seems to be, and the planets rotate around it on crystal spheres. People ask questions in the medieval world just as they do today. What makes the planets and the stars move? Because of course the stars move. It's often, I think I've got a slide on this. Okay, so that's a view of what a medieval person might see if they could peek through the firmament of heaven. They'd look into heaven itself, and this is another perspective, that God was so much part of the world that everything in the world was really imbued with God's mystical presence. And there was what was called a chain of being, in which the highest and most holy and most powerful object in the world being just the stuff that they could see, was God. And he kind of devolved power to the saints and angels, who devolved it to the princes and kings and emperors of the world, who devolved it to their subjects. And then at the bottom of it all was the plants and animals, who were subject to humans, just as humans were subject to nobles, just as nobles were subject to the princes of the church, the Pope, and the Pope was subject to God. So there was a view of a very hierarchical view of the entire world. And that's the world that William of Ockham was born into. Social structure was something also ordained by God and thought to have that same kind of structure as the heavens. If you look at how the heavens were structured with their concentric circles of crystal spheres, the structure of the social world was also like that. Now, as I said, the medieval scientific theology inherited a lot from Aristotle, but some of the medieval philosophers and theologians tried to improve on it, because Aristotle's God was a rather impersonal being, if he was anyone at all. So people like Thomas Aquinas did his best to try to incorporate the Christian God into Aristotle's scientific world. And one of the ways he did that was to claim that there was a scientific proof of God. In fact, there were 5 scientific proofs of God. And we know some of them, and I think I'll mention in a slide or two, at least one of them. So that he thought God was provable. So like any scientific knowledge, it could be proved. He also had the idea of universals, which we'll talk about, and teleology, which we're also talking about. All movement in the world must have a mover. We know that if you kick a ball for a football to move, it's got to be kicked by someone. And if you took all of those someones backwards in time, what Aristotle claimed was you would come to the prime mover, who Aquinas labeled as the Christian God. So he produced a lot of these, several of these proofs, one on the prime mover, another on prime causes. If you have causes, if something causes another, then that something has got to be caused by something else. And if you go backwards, you come to the prime cause, and again, that's God. So those were Aquinas' proofs of God. And his other arm of his theology was universals. Now, what are universals? This is important to understand William of Ockham. Universals were meant to underpin the reality of the world. And they go back to Plato and then Aristotle, who asked the question, well, how do we know that a ring, for example, is round? And Plato came up with the idea that there are perfect examples of every kind of object in the mystical world of Platonic forms, of where you would have the perfect circle, the perfect sphere, the perfect triangle, the perfect person, the perfect box, the perfect cherry. They get their reality from this world of universals, of hidden objects, the universals, that make things into the way they are. They're universal for redness, they're universal for roundness. And this was Plato's idea, but Aristotle took it over. It was Plato's forms that became Aristotle's universals. So, for example, a cherry would have a universal of roundness. It would have because it comes in pairs, it would have a universal of number two, universal of redness, and universal of sweetness. And that's when the theologians of the medieval world, early medieval, were doing science, what they mostly did was kind of dissect objects into their universals. That's what they spent all their time doing. Okay, well, a box, it's got a universal of wood, a universal of squareness, etc. And that's mostly what they spent their time doing. And William of Ockham came along and said, no, it's all nonsense. So, but why Aquinas like the universals is because ultimately for Aquinas and still for the Catholic Church today, they still deal with these universals in their theology. They're all in the mind of God. So whereas for Plato, the universals were in his Platonic, mystical Platonic realm, for the Christian theologians, the universals were in the mind of God. And that's how the world was endowed with reality. Everything came from the mind of God. So the world was imbued with godness, if you like. So that's made science, made theology a science. And as I mentioned before, the whole chain of being was thought to be underpinned by universals. There was a universal of kingship, a universal of queenship, a universal of being a peasant or being a laborer, etc. And that meant that every man or woman had their place in the world depending on what universal God had given them, whether the universal of a slave, a serf, a king, prince, etc., priest. All of those had universals. And they were all essentially universals in the mind of God. So this came with it the philosophy that the way the world was the way the world that God had willed the world to be. So if you were born a peasant, then you better be happy staying a peasant because that's what God made you as. And you have the universal of being a peasant and you're stuck with it. So this gave a perspective of also of teleology. It's the other aspect which Aquinas brought into Christian theology. And it comes with its causes. Causes, he claimed that everything in the world had a cause, and those causes ultimately can be traced back to God. So a pig was there for us to eat, and it was even said that life in the pig was the reason that the telos, the purpose of a pig being alive, was to keep its meat fresh, so we could eat it. So everything in the world had a reason, a cause, and this was what we know as teleology. So even stuff like wolves or foxes, I think that's a fox there. What's their purpose in the world? Well, their purpose was to maybe kill pests such as crows, or even provide examples for us. The fox was a sly animal, so he taught us what slyness was about. The lion was a noble animal, so he taught us about nobility, etc. So teleology was another aspect of it. So teleology also provided stuff for the monks to do to look at all the causes of everything. So God was there. And God was a scientist, but he was a scientist in the perspective of science, of medieval science. God's omnipotence. Now, this became a kind of clash with Greek science, because in Greek, the Greek gods never were omnipotent. Zeus had his faults, and they sometimes were defeated, but the Christian God was omnipotent. And that clashed with some of Aristotle's science, because Aristotle said things like, a vacuum is impossible. some of the Christian theologians, took that along. Those who believed in Aristotle, others said no, God can do anything. So there's a clash then between the theologians who looked towards Aristotle to provide their science, and a Western Christianity, and this led into bans on issues such as whether there should be limits on God's omnipotence. Could God really make a vacuum or not? And that led to a clash. And then William of Ockham came in at this kind of time when there was a clash. He studied theology at the Queen of Sciences at Oxford, but didn't complete his degree. Parts of the reason he set about undermining everything that had gone before in terms of the theological science. Disproved Aquinas' 5 proofs of God. He said, okay, for example, on the causes, he said, okay, there must be an ultimate cause, but we don't know if it's a god. It could be a donkey. It could be anything. We don't know. He said something like it might be some explosion or something in the past that started the world. So and similarly with, and he also, what we're going to be talking about, he had he really advocated the principle that science had to be based on a minimum of causes. So entities should not be multiplied beyond necessity is how we understand Occam's razor. If you can explain a light in the sky by thinking about a satellite rather than inventing flying saucers, then that's an easier explanation. And that's what we should do. So Occam introduced his razor, disproved the proofs of God, introduced his razor, and started really then forced theologians who wanted to move along the scientific route to ask the question, well, at the time, people were thinking that angels pushed all the planets around the sky. Well, maybe we could get rid of that. So entities should not be multiplied beyond necessity is a bit of a problem when you filled the world with loads of entities that you've got no evidence for their existence. He eliminated universals and said, no, if God wants to make a ring, he'll just make a ring. He doesn't need a universal for a ring. He'll just make a ring round, blah, blah, blah. So that was the universal structure before. That was the structure of social structure before Occam. And Occam came and said, why is a prince a prince? Why is a woman a woman? Why is a father a father? In Aristotle and the Christian theologians' view, because they have the universal of fatherhood, for example, if you're a fatherhood. Occam said a father is a father because he has a son. That's it. So there's no universal. It's just a relationship between you and other objects like a father and a son. So this proved Aquinas' 5 proofs of God, eliminated universals, eliminated the teleology, and teleology. How do you do that? This is a quote from William of Ockham. Someone who's just following natural reason would claim that the question why is something, why is this in the world, is inappropriate in the case of natural actions. But he would maintain there is no real question to ask someone like, for what reason is fire generated? That's what we mean by teleology. What's the purpose of fire? You might ask, why does the fire heat the wood rather than cool it? I reply, such is its nature. Now, a natural agent is predetermined by its nature, not by its end. Now, about 300 or 400 years later, the Enlightenment supposedly got rid of teleology. William of Ockham dismissed it in the 14th century. So it has a longer history of being attacked. So that's, it really demolished medieval sciences in theological science. And what did he do then? All of those things like the proofs of God, he used his razor to get rid of all the universals. But what that did is said, if you want to study a box, you're not studying a universal, you have to then study the box. So instead of monks sitting in their scriptoriums writing about the universals of wood and the universal this and this and that, what William Ockham said, if you want to know what a box is, go and pull it apart. And that brings science from a mystical and philosophical enterprise to one that's based on empiricism. And yes, on scientific theology, we have. So essentially, what William of Ockham did was cut the link between science and God, and particularly, I think, do I have? So there's no link then between theology and God. So William of Ockham said the article of Christian faith should be accepted as such. They cannot be proved by reason, nor can they be made the basis of knowledge. Science and theology are essentially different and must not be confused. Now, as far as I know, well, this view that science and theology are different, science and religions, is really the basis of Western culture. The separation of religion from science, and indeed the state has been part of it as well. And the first person to make this kind of statement, as far as I know, in all of human history, and if one of your listeners knows of an earlier instance of someone making a clear distinction between science, which William of Ockham claimed is based on reason, and theology, which he claimed was based on philosophy and the scriptures. And then please get in touch and let me know, because this to me is the first clear statement that science and theology are different. And obviously in some places of the world we haven't broken that, we haven't delivered that wedge between science and religion, which William of Ockham did in the 13th, 14th century. But largely our modern world is based upon that division. So what, a little bit more history of William of Ockham. So he insisted that God is unknowable and so cannot be discovered via science. And this part of this also goes back to that omnipotence thing. If you believe God is omnipotent, then you can't know anything about the God because he can be anything he likes. Insisted that God is completely unknowable and so cannot be discovered via science, because there's nothing in the world. God could be making stuff this way, or it could be making it another way. You don't know. So God is unknowable. So science is not a route to God. But anyway, all of this was very heretical at the time, and William of Ockham was accused of heresy. He had to travel to Avignon to be charged in front of the Pope and be tried in front of the Pope as a heretic. But not being someone to be cowed by papal authority, he accused the Pope of being a heretic, and then had to flee Avignon, chased by a posse of papal soldiers, and eventually found the protection of the Holy Roman Emperor, who was crowning his own Pope in Rome at the time, and returned to Munich with the Holy Roman Emperor. So he has an interesting history, William of Ockham. And he established what was called the Via Moderna, which is a new way of looking at the world, which swept through European universities and became very influential in the early pioneers of science. And its principle was elimination of universals, elimination of teleology, preference for simple solutions, separation of science from religion. So essentially modern science and the structure of modern science swept through Europe, influencing the Reformation and modern science. Luther, for example, was a big fan of Occam. Occam is my teacher. So Occam's razor. Now we've done the history. Now we go on to Occam's razor in science. And first thing, Occam's razor in the heavens. And the first thing that I want you to think about, what happens to stars when you're not looking at them? And everyone in the medieval world will be familiar with this because they spent much more time at night. But if you ask most people, I've asked a lot of people, and I must, before I learned this, I hadn't known it myself. What do the stars do when you're not looking at them? I kind of think of them, okay, they're in the sky, but they rotate every day around, in perfect circles, around the North Pole star, the North Star. And that's all of the stars do that. And if you you're in the medieval world, you would have known that, and this is why Aristotle, or in the ancient world, you would have known that. This is where Aristotle put his pins of spheres on to explain the rotation of the stars and the planets. So the ancient crystal spheres explained that rotation by saying the stars were stuck on the outer sphere, crystal sphere. They were crystal because you could see through them. Obviously, you can't see these spheres, so they must be transparent. And then what Aristotle did was pin the planets and the sun and the moon on these spheres. But there was a problem. It works very well for the stars because they do move around in perfect circles, but the planets don't. They wander across the sky. This is why they're called the wandering stars. Planet means a wandering star. So they wander across the constellation. And there was a problem of working out how you get a planet on this crystal sphere configuration. And Ptolemy worked out a mathematical way of expressing it. Ptolemy, the last great astronomer of the ancient world, worked it out and worked out this crazy system of planets moving in circles within circles within circles, which were called epicycles. He never really talked about the crystal spheres. It was just a means of calculating the motion of the heavens. But it was really incompatible with this. But no one really worried about it. They just kind of thought, okay, spheres are in the heavens until people like Copernicus. Well, actually, before Copernicus, the first person to start to unpick this was a Occamist scholar in Paris, who Jean Buridan, who said that, well, having all these stars rotating around the Earth very fast every day, and they knew that they were a long way away, the stars, instead of having them move so fast and all together, why not say that the Earth spins? You can see the quote here. Better to say that the Earth, which is very small, is moved most rapidly. The highest sphere, the one carrying stars, is at rest. Jean Buridan, who was an Occamist scholar and embarrassed at the time, at first tried to still the stars, at least, to keep them still, in 1340, so well before Copernicus. But then Copernicus really took this idea to make a different model of the solar system. But interestingly, if you look at the quote, after I had addressed myself to the very difficult and almost insoluble problem, suggestion at length came to me how it being the motion of the stars as described by Ptolemy, this kind of circles within circles within circles, there must be a simpler solution, he said, with fewer and much simpler constructions that were formerly used. So he's using the Occam's razor, or at least trying to use Occam's razor to try to find a simpler solution to this complex cycle within cycles. And he obviously had that influence from stuff coming down from William of Ockham. So here's Copernicus's heliocentric cosmos with the sun in the center. And it made the stars fixed. They stay in there where they are, and the planets then rotate. Now, Copernicus got it wrong. It's often said, no, he didn't get anywhere near it, but yes, he did. He did. He had them moving in perfect circles, but that was a big improvement in terms of the simplicity of the model of the solar system. And you can see that here. On the left is a Copernicus's view of the motion of a planet Venus in Copernicus's heliocentric view. Now, there are some deviations from this because, in fact, he got it wrong, and we know that the planets don't travel in perfect circles. But when you see pictures of the solar system, it looks like they're very elongated. They're very nearly perfect circles. So actually, if you plot it out, it looks like a perfect circle in a Venus's orbit in a heliocentric frame of reference. So it looks much simpler than on the right. If you take a different perspective and take a geocentric perspective, you can, of course, still plot the motion of Venus, but you get this crazy pattern. See, the Earth then is rotating through all these motions. So now, as I said, Copernicus got it wrong in that he set perfect circles for the orbits. The man who bent those circles was Johannes Kepler, who also argued. Actually, it's interesting to point out that Copernicus's model with perfect circles in it did have some incorrect assumptions in it, that the planets had to be traveling at the same speed all the time. It made no better predictions than Ptolemy's model, which is interesting. And it shows that you can get something completely wrong and you can still get a pretty good model. The predictions were no better than Ptolemy's. So Copernicus' only argument at that time in the 15th century was that it was simpler. He didn't argue it was better, he argued it was simpler. So he was taking the view of Occam's razor, and if you can model the world in a simpler way, then it's more likely to be true. Johannes Kepler found a way of getting an even simpler model with by slightly bending the orbits. And as I said, this is the way the solar system is usually drawn, but in fact, they're very nearly circular orbits. And Johannes Kepler said, nature loves simplicity and unity, and often a single cause will produce many effects. So again, he argued from the basis of simplicity as being the important benefit of his system. And his laws then are another way of simplifying even further. We won't go into Kepler's laws, but essentially that it was a way of describing the motion of the planets in a few equations. So instead of just having having to draw them out, you could describe the motion of the planets with equations, and those equations could be applied to any system of orbits, and such as the asteroids. Still, the objects that were unknown at the time still can be described with Kepler's laws. So they describe the thing about laws, scientific laws, is they make the world simpler. You can account for a lot more phenomena, a lot more observations with a set of laws. But they only applied in the heavens, Kepler's laws, until Galileo came along, and he showed that he could get laws out of terrestrial motion as well. Gravity, he showed falls. There is a law of acceleration due to gravity, and he again pointed out that once you know these laws, then the world becomes simpler. And he said that the principle of simplicity, supported by the very true, his laws, finding these laws was supported by a very true maxim of Aristotle, which teaches us that more causes are in vain when fewer suffice. In fact, Aristotle never said that, but Occam essentially did. So he was also basing his confidence in his science being correct because his laws provided a simplification. Suddenly, although Kepler's laws you could apply to the heavens, now he found that laws, simplifying laws, could be found that would account for terrestrial objects as well. And of course, the biggest simplification in scientific history of the world is Newton's laws of motion. Showed that all of the motions pretty much on Earth and in the heavens that they could see could be accounted for by his three laws of motion and his universal gravitation law. And again, truth is ever to be found in simplicity and not in the multiplicity and confusion of things. So again, his confidence in these laws was at least partly based on the fact that they simplified the world. And now both the heavens and the Earth's motions could be accounted for by the same set of laws, whereas previously the heavens were accounted for by Kepler's laws, terrestrial motion by Galileo's laws. Newton unified them. And I've put Newton's third law, for every action there is an equal and opposite reaction, to illustrate the importance of simplification. You could say for every object for every action, there is an equal opposite reaction. Or you could say for every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction plus an angel who is pushing on the other side. You would be pushing this box, and you could take Newton's law to account for the motion, or you could say, well, there's an angel on the other side also pushing. Or you could say there's 2 angels, or 3 angels, or 4 angels. You can make it as complex as you like. And this is the way that science was before Occam's razor was used. You just did invent something. If you want to account for a motion that you didn't know, well, there's an angel up there pushing it, or there's a god, or whatever. And what science learned to do was say, no, we can get rid of the angels, we can get rid of the gods by just having a limited number of entities such as force, acceleration, and things like this, and describe the world in a simpler set of principles. And of course, they can't remember why I put the moon version, Earthrise. But I think to say that the great thing about Newton's laws is that they're universal. They will account for the motion of the sun, the moon, and all the planets, and any planet in any other solar system. So they simplify a lot of motions. And interesting that William of Ockham had some prescience of this notion, writing back in the 14th century, it appears to me, because when people thought about what the moon is made of, they thought it was made of some ethereal stuff, and the stars in heaven were made of different stuff. And Ockham said, well, it appears to me that the matter in the heavens is of the same kind as the matter here below. This is because plurality should never be positive beyond necessity. So that's why I put that picture of the moon rise, that Occam predicted that it would be pretty much the same matter up in the sky as it was down on Earth. And simple laws and technology, once you grasp the other advantage of simple laws is you can then make predictions with them. Now, if you believe everything's moved around by angels, who knows what they're going to do next? But if you believe that they're moved around by Boyle's law, for example, the motion of molecules in a gas, then you can make things like pistons and steam trains, and by these kind of by simple things like Boyle's laws. And again, Robert Boyle, who was the first person to really try to apply this kind of science below the level of big objects. A great part of the world of true philosophers has been to reduce the true principles of things to the smallest number they can without making them insufficient. So obviously those principles that Boyle discovered by using vacuum pumps and looking at compressing gases and looking at heat and pressure and things like that, once you manage to generate laws like Boyle's law and the other gas laws developed by other people, you can make engines, you can make machines, you can start to manipulate the world, and you can start driving the Industrial Revolution. So that would not be possible if, by the way, at the time that Boyle was working with, he was at the time he was also arguing with the philosophers who were saying, well, what's moving these atoms and molecules? It must be angels. And he said, no, get rid of all of that. But imagine it trying to build a steam train if you thought all the molecules were being pushed around by angels. What do you do? But with Boyle's law, you can make machines, you can start to improve the world with technology. So with all of these other scientists as well, like Boltzmann, etc., James Clerk, Maxwell, their laws again simplify many phenomena to simple laws. Okay, and this is a bit of a jump, but in biology, it's often said biology is irreducibly complex, and but natural selection unifies biology, and this was a line by one of the discoverers of natural selection, Alfred Russel Wallace, who, along with Charles Darwin, discovered the idea of natural selection. Before this was discovered, the only way to account for the diversity of the world was that it must be made. How else would you account for this vast diversity of different creatures who are exquisitely tuned to do what they needed to do, whether it's pollinating flowers or chasing antelopes across the savannah, etc. That was the only way you could account for all that, was really with creation. It was the only explanation in town. But natural selection suddenly said, okay, you don't need a creator, or at least you don't need a creator for the diversity of life. The theory, natural selection itself, is exceedingly simple. The facts on which it rests come under a few simple and easily understood causes. So again, why the people who discovered the theory of natural selection, they could see that it could simplify the biological world as well. And going forward, Albert Einstein unified space and time. Who would have thought that space and time were the same thing? And what Newton showed was motions in the heavens were the same as the motions down on Earth, as Galileo had been studying. Einstein said that space and time are the same thing. Essentially, all of science is reducing things that are different to as few causes and as few entities as possible. And Einstein admitted that himself. Nature is a realization of the simplest conceivable mathematical ideas. So it's an underappreciated, it's an underappreciated tool of science. Symmetry. Symmetry is a simplicity. If objects are symmetrical, then they're more simple. And we can see that in these two butterflies. At the moment, we're looking at one of their wings. They look equally complex. But you can see that they're not. The one that is symmetrical is simpler than the one that does not have symmetrical wings. So symmetry is another simplicity that can be seen in the world. And it's the basis of Noether's notion and demonstration that the conservation laws of physics, like the conservation of energy, the conservation of momentum, are really a kind of simplicity. They're identifying a symmetry in things that were thought to be different, like the rotational symmetry or conservation of angular momentum is there to make sure that rotational symmetry works, that whichever way you're looking, the world's going to be the same. And for that to be true, you need to have the law of conservation of angular momentum. So she showed all of the major laws of physics have an underlying symmetry. And that notion of symmetry has gone forward to, for example, being involved in the prediction of the Higgs boson. And that is really based on trying to find a way of making sense of mass and finding a simple solution, and finding that one of those solutions was the Higgs boson. And that provided a solution to the problem, but they could have invented lots of Higgs bosons. It would equally work if there were different Higgs bosons with different masses, different energies, etc. They chose the simplest solution, having one, and so far that's true. So far that seems to work out. There's only one Higgs boson. But the interesting question is, why is simplicity such a good tool for working out the universe? And it's certainly something to do with Bayesian inference. Simple explanations are more probable than complex ones because they have a high likelihood of generating the data. Just unpack this. I'm sure many of your readers will be familiar with Bayesian inference, but basically simplicity is in Bayesian reasoning because it's in the factor called likelihood, the probability of the data given the model. And that, excuse me, that's a principle in Bayesian reasoning. Bayesian reasoning is really taking a prior probability, which you can pull out of your head. What is the probability of the light in the sky being a flying saucer? You can pull a prior probability out of your head, but then you multiply it by the likelihood that your model, whether it's a flying saucer, will generate the data, is what you next look at. And that's really how you do Bayesian inference. And you can consider it, one way of looking at it is if I put these two dice here, and if I give a live lecture, I have the two dice. So you can imagine me having the two dice. And in one hand, I've got the 6-sided dice, and another, I've got this rather odd 60-sided dice. Okay. And I throw one of them, and you don't know which one I throw, but I call out a number, and I call out the number 5, and ask you, no, let's do it differently. I call out the number 20. I call out the number 20. I ask you which one dice have I thrown. Of course, you say, okay, it's a 60-sided one. It's the only possible one. And then second, I throw another. I pick them both up and throw one of them again. You don't see which one. And I call out the number 5. And then I ask you, okay, which dice have I thrown? And most people would say, well, it could be either. 50% chance it could be either because 5 is on both of them. But it's not true. It's much more likely to be the simpler dice because it has a 1 in 6 chance of throwing a 5. Whereas the 60-sided dice has a 1 in 60 chance of throwing a 5. So the likelihood, this in the Bayesian reasoning term, the likelihood of a 6-sided dice throwing a 5 is 1 in 6. The likelihood of a 60-side is 1 in 60. So that is how Bayesian reasoning works so well. And you can look at that with regard to, say, the motion of the planets and the Copernican or Kepler's model compared to the Ptolemaic. What's the likelihood of the model that you have on the right generating any kind of data? It could. The thing is, it could generate any data. If you can move your planets around on circles, well, why not have another circle to move it over here, and another one to move it over there? So essentially, you could generate any data whatsoever. Whereas once you've got Kepler's model, it makes very precise predictions. So if you see that the planets are moving along these laws that Kepler discovered, it would be extraordinary if Kepler's model wasn't true, because it makes very specific and very tight predictions of where the planets ought to be in a particular day, in a particular year. And if you find it in that position, it would be a miracle if Kepler's laws weren't true. So simplicity works because it makes tight predictions, and tight predictions, as another philosopher, who am I thinking of? Famous English philosopher of science. Anyway, it'll come to me. But said that simplicity is good because it makes tight predictions and it makes theories disprovable. Disprovability is important. So what is science? And final point I'm coming to, what is science all about? And the problem with science is that if you go to people who don't really kind of have a feel for science and don't really understand what it is, and you try to tell them what science is, when you come with an explanation like this, which comes from Wikipedia, a systematic enterprise that builds and organizes knowledge in the form of testable explanations and predictions about the world. Well, does that really define science? What about cookery? Systematic enterprise that builds and organizes knowledge in the form of testable recipes and predictions about what they'll taste like. Works just as well. What about plumbing? What about being an electrician? It really doesn't mean anything. It's how we do everything. A plumber makes testable predictions about what kind of nut he's going to need to tighten up this leak, and etc. So everything that we do, we build on that definition there. So it doesn't define science at all. But if you ask scientists to define what they're doing, they usually don't really know. They come up with explanations like this, definitions like this. So and also alchemists, systematic enterprise that organizes knowledge in the form of testable explanations. Well, they made lots of explanations that were testable. If I do this and that, it's going to make gold. In fact, none of them did, but it didn't discourage the alchemists. They just kept on going. And the astrologers make predictions about where the heavens are and where the planets are based on based on the Kepler and Newton's laws, of course, but they do make predictions and try to organize knowledge in a way that makes sense to them about when you were born and which planet was where. So they make predictions and make testable, they're usually tested incorrectly. But anyway, what is science? And this is what I think science is: a systematic enterprises that use logic, mathematics, and experiment to identify the simplest models of the world that provide the most accurate and general predictions. And I think if we taught science as that, because again, when you teach science is taught, it's normally taught as a kind of collection of facts about, chemistry, and this chemical does that, and this, and this material does this, or when you drop something, it will fall, and it's described by this law. It's just a hodgepodge of different ideas, different facts, and it doesn't really make sense what it's all about. And I think we've lost sight of what it's all about. And what it really is all about is finding the simplest descriptions of the world that provide the most accurate and general predictions. And from those predictions, we make models, we make testable predictions that we can use to build machines, or make vaccines, or make artificial limbs, or whatever else. But that's what it's about. Unless you have simple models that can do that, make tight predictions about what kind of object you want to make, for example, then technology does not work. So Occam's razor in daily life, fake news. Well, you can. We all, it wasn't that's long ago that we all had to hear about these crazy ideas about where the COVID virus came from, and one of them was Bill Gates made it and put it into the vaccines in order to control us, because it put some microprocessor into the vaccines. And you can believe that kind of thing, but they're complicated. You've got to believe that Bill Gates is going to do this, that he has this technology to do this, which didn't exist. You've got to believe the medical profession are in on it, and the military, and all sorts of other people. But the problem with it is that if you are prepared to take all these crazy beliefs and put them into an explanation, then anything is believable. And this is where Occam's razor comes in. It only accepts the simplest explanation. And this is how I sometimes describe it, the pocket razor. The problem is that, rather like when I was talking about Newton's laws, and you can have every action there is an equal and opposite reaction, or an equal or opposite reaction plus an angel plus 1,000 angels, devils, all sorts of things. You can add them to it. For every problem, there is probably an infinite number of possible answers of increasing complexity. But the great thing about the simplest solution, it's singular. There will only be a single simplest solution, at least that we can find. There may be another one even simpler. But how do you identify the simplest solutions? And to find the simplest theory, and therefore the most likely to be true, choose the one that can be explained in the fewest words. So you either say with the COVID that, what causes COVID, the virus came from a lab, or it came from an animal, we don't know, but it's the virus. Or you have this complicated explanation, which if you had to explain all of the aspects of it, would take you an hour or more. So what I advocate is everyone has their own pocket razor to find the simplest solution to problems. And I think that's it. And so that's all in the book, Life is Simple, published a few years ago. Thank you, Devin.